April 6th, 1199. Chalus-Chabrol Castle. The first sensation is the smell. It is a sweet, cloying odor of rot, the smell of flesh turning upon itself, a stench that even the thick incense burning in the corner of the royal tent cannot conquer. It is the perfume of gangrene. Then comes the heat. A suffocating, damp warmth that clings to the skin, making the chainmail of the guards by the entrance feel like a furnace, and the heavy tapestries depicting glorious hunts seem to mock the squalid reality within. The only sounds are the soft hiss of a tallow torch, spitting grease into the oppressive air, the distant nervous murmurings of soldiers outside, and a sound that cuts through everything else, the ragged, shallow breathing of a dying giant. This is not the death chamber of a king. It is a butcher's tent, a place of sordid decay, and the man lying on the cot, his massive frame racked with fever, is Richard, first of his name, King of England, Duke of Normandy, Aquitaine, and Gascony, Count of Poitou, Anjou, Maine, and Nantes, Lord of Cyprus, Overlord of Brittany, and the warrior known to the world as Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart. His eyes, the chroniclers say, were a piercing blue, are now clouded with the gray film of agony. The wound in his shoulder, just below the neck, is not a glorious scar from a Saracen scimitar in the Holy Land. It is a festering, blackened pit, the work of a single crossbow bolt fired from the battlements of this insignificant third-rate castle in the Limousin, a bolt loosed, they say, by a mere boy. The great warrior who had stared down the armies of Saladin, who had survived shipwreck and imprisonment at the hands of a German emperor, was now being laid low by a pathetic scrap of iron in a pointless siege over a rumored hoard of Roman gold. The central paradox of his life is crystallizing in these final, agonizing hours. The lion, the very symbol of martial valor and crusading zeal, is not falling with a roar on the grand stage of history, but is dying with a feverish whimper in the forgotten wings. This is the narrative of him, Richard Plantagenet, a man who was more myth than monarch, a walking embodiment of the chivalric ideal whose reality was drenched in blood, ambition, and a profound, almost tragic, neglect of the very kingdom that gave him his crown. This was the saga of a king who spent only a handful of months in the country he was meant to rule, a ruler who famously declared he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer, all to fund his insatiable thirst for glory abroad. To understand this man, to unravel the Gordian knot of his character, we must ask the core question that hangs in the fetid air of his death tent. How? How did the hero of the Third Crusade, the man who made the mighty Saladin tremble, the peerless commander whose name was a byword for courage, fall so far? How did he end up here, dying at the hand of a peasant over a squabble for treasure, his vast Angevin empire already beginning to crumble around his still warm body? What fatal flaw in his character? What twist of geopolitical fate? What toxic brew of pride and obsession led the Lion of Christendom to this silent, ignominious end? To answer this, we must return to the world that spawned him, a world of sharp steel and shifting allegiances, a world teetering on the brink of profound change, where the old certainties of faith and feudalism were beginning to crack under the relentless pressure of a new, more cynical age of power politics. The story of Richard's death does not begin with the crossbow bolt, but in the very crucible of his birth and the violent, treacherous world he was destined to command. To understand this man, we must first return to the world of the late 12th century, a vast and chaotic chessboard upon which the great game of thrones was played with merciless intensity. In the East, the dream of a Christian Jerusalem lay shattered. The Holy City, captured by the First Crusade a century earlier, had fallen back into Muslim hands under the brilliant and unified leadership of Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin. His victory at the Horns of Hattin in 1187 was not just a military catastrophe for the Crusader states. It was a spiritual body blow to all of Christendom, a divine rebuke that sent shockwaves of shame and fury from the cobbled streets of Paris to the misty shores of England. It was this event that set the stage for the Third Crusade, a grand enterprise that would draw the three greatest monarchs of Europe, Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of France, and Richard of England, into its vortex. Further to the east, the Byzantine Empire, the ancient shield of Christendom, was in a state of terminal decline, consumed by internal corruption and court intrigue, a pale shadow of its former glory. To the north and east of Europe, the great pagan lands of the Baltic were slowly being ground down by the relentless advance of the Teutonic Knights, a military order that blended monastic piety with ruthless colonial ambition. And at the heart of it all lay the central drama of Western Europe, the titanic struggle between two rival dynasties. On one side stood the House of Capet, rulers of France whose king, Philip II, was a master of patience, cunning, and political maneuvering, a man who sought to consolidate his power and forge a centralized French kingdom from a patchwork of fiercely independent duchies. On the other side was the sprawling, almost unmanageable entity known as the Angevin Empire, a vast collection of territories stretching from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees, held together only by the force of will of its Plantagenet rulers. This was Richard's inheritance, a glorious, powerful, but fundamentally unstable empire, a kingdom in England he barely knew, and vast continental possessions where his authority was constantly challenged by rebellious vassals and the scheming king of France. Richard was not just a king, he was the linchpin of this fragile construction, and his personal character, his love of war, his disdain for administration, his focus on personal glory, would prove to be the empire's greatest asset and ultimately its fatal weakness. The crucible that forged Richard's character was a family environment so toxic, so rife with ambition and betrayal, that it was known to contemporaries as the Devil's Brood. His father was Henry II, a man of volcanic energy and formidable intellect, the architect of the Angevin Empire, and a king who clawed his way to power through civil war and sheer force of will. He was a brilliant administrator and a legal reformer, but as a father he was a tyrant, dangling the prospect of power before his sons, only to snatch it away, playing them off against each other in a cynical game of control. His mother was the legendary Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman of extraordinary beauty, intelligence, and political acumen. Once Queen of France, she divorced her pious French husband to marry the dynamic Henry, bringing her vast and wealthy duchy of Aquitaine into the Plantagenet fold and creating the empire. But their marriage, initially a passionate union of equals, devolved into a bitter war. Eleanor, feeling marginalized and disrespected by Henry, encouraged her sons to rebel against their father, a decision that would plunge the empire into a generation of civil war and earn her 16 years of imprisonment at Henry's command. Richard was her favorite, the child of her beloved Aquitaine, and he inherited her poetic soul, her love of the South, and her fierce, indomitable will. He grew up in a world where love and loyalty were political commodities, where a brother's hand could hold a dagger as easily as a cup, and where a father's authority was something to be challenged, not revered. This childhood of gilded privilege was also a relentless education in rebellion. He learned statecraft not in a council chamber, but on the battlefield, leading his first army in Aquitaine as a teenager, crushing rebellions with a ferocity that stunned even veteran commanders. He learned that power was not given, but taken, and that the only true security lay in military strength. The seeds of the future king were sown here. The peerless general, the restless warrior, but also the man who saw governance as a burden and peace as a tedious interlude between wars. He was forged not to be a king in the administrative mold of his father, but a hero in the mold of the epic poems he so admired, a warlord destined for glory, even if that glory came at the cost of his own patrimony. The first true blooding of the young lion, his formal entry into the great and terrible game of Plantagenet family politics, was the Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174. This was not a simple rebellion. It was a continental firestorm that pitted Henry II against a formidable coalition of his own wife and 3 of his sons, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, who were in turn supported by his greatest rivals, King Louis VII of France and William the Lion, King of Scots. Richard, then only 16 years old, was already the Duke of Aquitaine, and it was from this power base, with the full encouragement of his mother Eleanor, that he threw himself into the fray. This act revealed the core of his being. He was not a reluctant rebel. He was an enthusiastic warrior, seizing the chance to prove his martial prowess against the formidable machinery of his own father's armies. The chroniclers of the time speak of his precocious military genius, his ability to inspire loyalty in his troops, and his personal bravery on the battlefield. He was not content to direct from the rear. He was always at the forefront, the very image of the chivalric warrior he aspired to be. But the revolt also showcased a darker side of his character, a capacity for ruthless ambition and a willingness to make alliances of convenience that bordered on treason. He swore fealty to the King of France, his father's sworn enemy, in exchange for support, a clear signal that his personal ambition trumped any sense of loyalty to the Angevin crown. While the Great Revolt ultimately failed, and Richard was forced to beg his father's forgiveness, the experience was formative. It taught him the brutal calculus of power. It confirmed his belief in the primacy of military force. And most importantly, it established the pattern of his life. A constant, restless struggle for dominance. A perpetual war against any authority that sought to constrain him, even that of his own father and king. This was not just a political dispute. It was a dynastic psychodrama that left deep scars. It solidified the enmity between father and sons, and set the stage for the years of further conflict that would ultimately see Richard, allied once again with the French king, hunt his own father to his death. Beneath the shining armor of the Crusader and the noble pronouncements of the troubadour king lay a deep, burning, and intensely personal motivation, an inner demon that drove Richard relentlessly toward the horizon of legend. His was not merely the ambition of a prince seeking a crown. It was the desperate, all-consuming need of a man to forge an identity for himself that was separate from and greater than that of his formidable father. Henry II was a giant of a man, an administrative genius who had built an empire through law, cunning, and tireless energy. But he was also a pragmatist, a man who saw war as a tool of policy, not as an end in itself. Richard was his antithesis. He disdained the tedious work of governance, the dusty ledgers, and the dry legal arguments. He saw his father's world of administration as a cage, and he sought escape and validation in the one arena where he could unequivocally surpass him, the theater of war. The chivalric ideal, with its emphasis on personal valor, glory, and knightly piety, was not just a code of conduct for Richard. It was a lifeline. It provided a framework, a justification for his restless nature and his obsession with martial pursuits. The crusade, therefore, was the ultimate expression of this inner drive. It was a chance to perform his identity on the world's grandest stage, to transform himself from a rebellious duke into a holy warrior, a champion of Christendom. Jerusalem was not just a strategic objective, it was a poetic one, the ultimate prize in the epic song of his own life that he was constantly composing. This is why he was so willing to bleed his kingdom dry, to sell off sheriffdoms and castles, to pour the wealth of England and Normandy into the coffers of war. The treasure was not for the state, it was for the legend. He was investing in his own immortality. This secret motivation also explains his flaws as a king. A ruler must care for the roots of his kingdom. Richard cared only for the flowering of his own personal glory. He saw England not as a home to be nurtured, but as a treasury to be plundered for his adventures. The well-being of his subjects, the stability of his administration, the future of his dynasty, all were secondary to the siren song of battle and the intoxicating promise of a fame that would echo through the ages. Every great drama is defined by the relationship between its protagonist and its antagonist, and for Richard the Lionheart, that defining relationship was the complex, toxic, and ultimately fateful bond he shared with Philip II of France, a man who began as his ally and ended as his nemesis. In the intricate dance of 12th century politics, they were initially partners in crime, two ambitious young princes united by a common enemy, Richard's father, Henry II. They were, according to one chronicler, so close that they ate from the same dish and slept in the same bed at night, a testament to a deep political and perhaps personal intimacy. Philip, the calculating prodigy of the House of Capet, saw in Richard the perfect tool to dismantle the overweening power of the Angevin Empire that surrounded and threatened his own kingdom. He encouraged Richard's rebellions, offered him sanctuary, and whispered promises of support, all while patiently waiting for the Plantagenet viper's nest to consume itself. The moment Henry II died, broken and defeated, and Richard ascended the throne, the nature of their relationship changed irrevocably. The ally became the rival. The stage was now set for a lifelong duel between two starkly contrasting characters. Richard was the lion, brave, impulsive, a brilliant tactician who lived for the glory of the battlefield. Philip was the spider, patient, cunning, a master strategist who preferred the battlefield of the council chamber and the subtle web of diplomacy and intrigue. While Richard was preparing to embark on his grand crusade, pouring all his energy and resources into the quest for glory in the East, Philip's ambitions remained firmly fixed at home. He took the cross alongside Richard, but it was a political maneuver. He had no intention of spending years fighting in the desert. His crusade was against the Plantagenet holdings in France. He would go to the Holy Land, make a token effort, and then use the first available pretext to return and begin dismembering Richard's continental empire, while the Lionheart was 1,000 miles away. This fateful encounter, this souring of alliance into bitter enmity, defined the entire trajectory of Richard's reign. Philip was the shadow that loomed over Richard's every triumph, the patient predator who understood that while Richard was winning glorious but strategically questionable battles in Palestine, the real prize, Normandy, Anjou, the very heart of the Angevin Empire, was being left dangerously unguarded. The moment the crown of England was placed upon his head in September 1189, Richard's singular, all-consuming focus became the financing of his crusade, and he approached this task not as a king husbanding his resources, but as a general requisitioning supplies for a vital campaign. The price of his power, the cost of his dream, was to be paid by his subjects, and he extracted it with a ruthless efficiency that stunned the kingdom. His first and most significant act as king was the imposition of the Saladin tithe, a tax that demanded 1/10 of all revenues and movable properties from every layperson. It was an unprecedented financial burden, a clear signal that the new king's priorities lay far to the east of England's shores. But taxes alone were not enough to satisfy his voracious appetite for funds. He turned his entire kingdom into a marketplace, putting everything up for sale. He sold castles, manors, and vast tracts of royal land. He sold public offices, sheriffdoms, and judicial appointments to the highest bidder, fundamentally compromising the royal administration his father, Henry II, had so painstakingly built. Famously, he sold the King of Scotland, William the Lion, freedom from his obligation of subservience to the English crown for the sum of 10,000 silver marks. When criticized for these actions, Richard is said to have quipped, "I would have sold London if I could have found a buyer." This was not hyperbole. It was a clear statement of intent. To him, the Kingdom of England was not a sacred trust, but a giant treasure chest, and his sole purpose was to pry it open and empty its contents to fund his holy war. In a matter of months, he amassed a fortune, a war chest of staggering proportions. But in doing so, he sowed the seeds of future instability. He alienated powerful nobles, weakened the institutions of government, and established a dangerous precedent of absentee kingship, treating England as a peripheral asset rather than the heart of his realm. He was purchasing his future glory with the coin of his kingdom's stability, a transaction whose true cost would only become apparent in the years to come, when he was a prisoner in a German dungeon, and his brother John and his rival Philip of France began to feast on the weakened body of his neglected empire. Looming over the eastern horizon, both as a terrifying threat and an irresistible challenge, was the figure of Salah al-Din, the charismatic and brilliant leader who had unified the Muslim world and retaken Jerusalem. For a man like Richard, obsessed with his own legend, Saladin was the perfect antagonist, a worthy adversary on the grandest of stages. Saladin was no mere barbarian warlord. He was a man of culture, piety, and a chivalry that was recognized and admired even by his Christian foes. He had risen from a Kurdish military family to become the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, forging a powerful Ayyubid empire that finally had the strength to challenge and expel the Crusader kingdoms that had clung to the Levantine coast for nearly a century. His reconquest of Jerusalem in 1187 was the culmination of his life's work, a triumph that restored the Holy City to Muslim rule after 88 years and made him a hero across the Islamic world. The conflict between Richard and Saladin was thus far more than a simple clash of armies. It was a deeply personal duel between two men who represented the pinnacle of their respective cultures. It was a contest of military genius, of willpower, and even of honor. The chroniclers of the Third Crusade are filled with stories, some perhaps apocryphal, of the two leaders exchanging gifts, of Saladin sending fresh fruit and snow from the mountains to cool a feverish Richard, of the two expressing a mutual, grudging respect. This was the macro-level conflict that Richard had so desperately sought. It was a war with a clear moral purpose, a heroic narrative he could step into. The Ayyubid Sultanate was a formidable military power, its armies disciplined, its emirs united under Saladin's command, and its resources vast. To defeat Saladin and reclaim Jerusalem would be the greatest martial achievement of the age, an act that would not only restore Christian pride, but would also cement Richard's name in history forever, eclipsing his father, his rivals, and every other prince in Christendom. This was the prize for which he had sold his kingdom's future, and he threw himself toward it with the joyous, single-minded focus of a man who has finally found a war worthy of his talents. The Siege of Acre, a grueling 2-year struggle that had begun before Richard even arrived in the Holy Land, culminated in a great Christian victory in July 1191. The city's surrender was a massive strategic and morale boost for the Crusaders. Yet, it was in the immediate aftermath of this triumph that Richard committed an act of such calculated brutality that it would forever stain his chivalric reputation. The terms of the surrender stipulated that Saladin would pay a large ransom, release hundreds of Christian prisoners, and return the relic of the True Cross, which he had captured at the Battle of Hattin. When the deadlines for payment and prisoner exchange passed, with Saladin seemingly prevaricating, Richard's patience snapped. He saw the delay as a tactic, a way for Saladin to keep the Crusader army bogged down at Acre while he regrouped. Faced with this logistical and strategic nightmare, Richard made a ruthless decision. On the 20th of August, he ordered that all the Muslim prisoners from the Acre garrison be taken out of the city and executed. In full view of Saladin's horrified army, some 2,700 men were systematically slaughtered by the Crusader forces. This was no act of battlefield rage. It was a cold, pragmatic act of military policy, intended to send a terrifying message and to free his army from the burden of guarding and feeding thousands of captives. For Richard, it was a necessary, if unpleasant, part of war. But for the Muslim world, it was an unforgivable atrocity, a violation of the very codes of honor that both sides claimed to respect. The massacre at Acre was a psychological breaking point. It hardened the resolve of Saladin's army, turning the war into a far more bitter and personal struggle. It also revealed the duality at the heart of Richard's character: the romantic troubadour on one hand, and the ruthless, pragmatic general on the other. He understood that in the brutal calculus of war, sentiment was a luxury. This single terrible act demonstrated to his allies and enemies alike that beneath the veneer of Christian piety and knightly honor, the Lionheart possessed a core of pure, unyielding steel. Freed from the quagmire of Acre, Richard began his march south toward the vital port of Jaffa, the next logical step on the road to Jerusalem. Saladin, enraged by the massacre and determined to stop the Crusader advance, shadowed him relentlessly. The Ayyubid army, composed largely of light cavalry, harassed Richard's column day and night, showering it with arrows, launching lightning raids, and attempting to break its disciplined formation. For weeks, the Christian army endured a marching hell under the blistering Palestinian sun. The heat was suffocating, the thirst was constant, and the psychological strain of the unending attacks was immense. Richard's genius as a commander was on full display. He organized his army into a tight, moving fortress, with the infantry and crossbowmen on the exposed flank, forming a protective screen for the heavily armored knights in the center. He enforced iron discipline, forbidding his knights from breaking ranks to charge the enemy, no matter the provocation. He knew that Saladin was trying to lure them into a trap, to separate the cavalry from the infantry and destroy them piecemeal. The moment of crisis came on the 7th of September, 1191, near the town of Arsuf. Saladin committed his full army to an all-out assault, hoping to finally shatter the Crusader line. The pressure was unbearable, particularly on the Knights Hospitaller at the rear. Finally, against Richard's express orders, two knights broke formation and charged. Seeing the line begin to crumble, Richard seized the opportunity from chaos. He understood that the moment had come. He ordered a full, coordinated charge, unleashing the pent-up fury of his knights in a thunderous wave of steel. The impact was devastating. The Ayyubid forces, caught by surprise by the sudden, perfectly timed counterattack, were shattered and routed. The Battle of Arsuf was Richard's masterpiece. It was a victory won through discipline, patience, and the brilliant tactical instinct to turn a moment of crisis into a decisive triumph. It shattered the myth of Saladin's invincibility in open battle and secured the entire coastline for the Crusaders, providing a vital supply line for any future assault on Jerusalem. Twice the Lionheart stood at the precipice of his life's ambition. Twice he led the army of the Cross to within sight of the golden dome of the rock and the dark stone of the Holy Sepulchre. The first time was in the winter of 1191. After fortifying the coast, he pushed his army inland through torrential rains and chilling mud. The supply lines stretched thin, the men sick and demoralized. They reached Beit Nuba, only 12 miles from Jerusalem. The sensory assault was one of cold and despair. The soldiers could feel the biting wind whipping through their threadbare cloaks, see the gray, weeping sky, and smell the damp rot of the winter landscape. In the distance, they could just make out the faint outline of the city's towers, a tantalizing, almost cruel vision. Richard, in a council with his commanders, made the agonizing decision to retreat. The army was in no condition to sustain a siege, and even if they took the city, they could not hope to hold it once the main body of Crusaders returned to Europe. The second time was in the summer of 1192. The army was stronger, the weather clear. They advanced again, this time with renewed hope. Richard rode with a small party to the top of a hill, and a companion cried out, "My lord, come here, and I will show you Jerusalem." The moment was electric. This was the culmination of everything: the taxes, the journey, the battles, the bloodshed. This was the zenith of the crusade, the very purpose of his existence. But according to the chronicles, Richard raised his shield to cover his face, refusing to look. He declared that if he was not worthy to conquer the holy city, he was not worthy to look upon it. It was a moment of supreme theatricality, but also of profound psychological weight. It was the ultimate triumph of his legend, the very image of the pious king, too humble in the face of God's city to even gaze upon it. It was a moment forged for the history books, for the songs of the troubadours, a glorious and tragic climax to his holy war. He was within arm's reach of his goal, the object of a lifetime of yearning, and yet he knew it was a mirage. The decision not to attack Jerusalem was the most pragmatic, strategically sound, and psychologically devastating choice of Richard's entire career. Standing on that hill, with the prize shimmering before him, the warrior poet was momentarily eclipsed by the shrewd general. He understood the brutal military reality that his more zealous commanders refused to accept. Taking the city was possible, holding it was not. Saladin's forces had poisoned the wells around Jerusalem, and the Crusader army could not survive a long siege. Even if they stormed the walls, their forces were too small. The majority of the knights and soldiers were pilgrims who would fulfill their vows and immediately set sail for home, leaving a skeleton garrison to be inevitably surrounded and annihilated by Saladin's vast empire. To take Jerusalem only to lose it again immediately would be a strategic disaster and a moral catastrophe, a hollow victory that would turn to ashes in his hands. This moment of cold, hard realism, however, was also a moment of profound personal failure. He had led the greatest army of Christendom across the world. He had defeated Saladin in open battle. He had conquered the coastline, and yet he was turning away from the ultimate prize. It was a wound to his pride, a stain on the perfect tapestry of the legend he was trying to weave. This moment of hubris was not in overreaching, but in the painful recognition of his own limitations. He, the Lionheart, the greatest warrior of his age, was forced to admit that there was a victory he could not achieve. This internal conflict, the war between the romantic idealist and the pragmatic commander, defined his crusade. He had come to the Holy Land to create a perfect song of chivalry and conquest, but the harsh prose of logistics and geopolitics had forced a bitter, unresolved ending. He would negotiate a truce with Saladin, guaranteeing Christian pilgrims access to the holy sites, a sensible compromise that was seen by many back in Europe as a shameful failure. The king who had set out to conquer a kingdom for God had to settle for being its first tour guide. With a 3-year truce secured with Saladin, Richard finally set sail for home in October 1192, eager to reclaim his kingdom from the machinations of his brother John and his great rival, Philip of France. But his journey home would prove to be more perilous than any battle against the Saracens. A storm in the Adriatic shattered his fleet, forcing him ashore near Venice. The lands he had to cross to reach his own territory were controlled by his enemies. His most direct route lay through the domains of Duke Leopold V of Austria, a man he had grievously insulted during the siege of Acre. Richard, in a fit of arrogance, had torn down Leopold's banner from the captured city walls, declaring that the standard of a mere duke had no place flying alongside those of the kings of England and France. It was a petty, prideful act, and Leopold's thirst for revenge had been simmering ever since. Disguised as a humble pilgrim, Richard attempted to sneak through Austria, but the disguise of a king is thin. His lordly demeanor, his use of foreign coins, and a magnificent ring on his finger gave him away. He was recognized and arrested near Vienna, becoming the prisoner of the very man he had so publicly humiliated. This was a bitter and galling irony. The great crusader, who had faced the might of Saladin, was now the captive of a minor European princeling. The humiliation was compounded when Leopold, realizing the immense value of his prisoner, sold Richard to his own overlord, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. The emperor, a man with his own political grievances against the Plantagenets, saw Richard as a golden goose and a powerful political pawn. The Lionheart was no longer a holy warrior. He was a commodity, locked away in a series of German castles, most famously trifles, while his enemies plotted and the price for his freedom was debated. The sworn enemy who brought him low was not the noble Saladin, but a fellow Christian, motivated by a petty and personal grudge. A clear sign that the world Richard was returning to was one where the grand ideals of the Crusade were being rapidly replaced by the far more cynical and personal politics of European power struggles. While the Lionheart languished in his German prison, his own vast empire, the source of his power and wealth, was being bled dry for a second time. Not for the glory of a crusade, but for the shame of a king's ransom. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI demanded the astronomical sum of 150,000 marks for Richard's release, a figure equivalent to 2 or 3 times the entire annual revenue of the English crown. It was a crippling, almost impossible amount, and the task of raising it fell to those Richard had left in charge. His mother, the indomitable Eleanor of Aquitaine, and his loyal ministers like Hubert Walter. What followed was an act of national exsanguination. A 25% tax was levied on all income and movable property. Churches were forced to melt down their sacred vessels of gold and silver. Monasteries were stripped of their wool, a cornerstone of the English economy. The kingdom was squeezed until it could give no more. This was the antithesis of reform and construction. It was a systematic deconstruction of the realm's wealth, a siphoning off of its very lifeblood to pay for the king's arrogant mistake at Acre and his subsequent misfortune. Meanwhile, the vultures were circling. Richard's absence created a power vacuum that his enemies were only too eager to fill. His treacherous brother, John, seeing his chance to seize the throne, entered into an open alliance with Richard's great nemesis, Philip II of France. John did homage to Philip for Richard's continental lands, and even offered the emperor a huge sum of money to keep his brother imprisoned indefinitely. Philip, for his part, launched a full-scale invasion of Normandy, seizing key castles and territories. The message he famously sent to John upon hearing of Richard's impending release said it all. "Look to yourself. The devil is loosed." Richard's captivity was a catastrophe for the Angevin Empire. It exposed its fundamental weakness, its utter reliance on the physical presence and military leadership of its king. Without Richard, it was a body without a head, vulnerable and easily dismembered. The ransom, when it was finally paid, secured the king's freedom, but at the cost of his kingdom's profound economic and political exhaustion. In the dark and desperate years of Richard's captivity, with the kingdom being torn apart by the treachery of Prince John and the invasions of the King of France, the one force that held the crumbling Angevin Empire together was the sheer, indomitable will of one woman, Eleanor of Aquitaine. By this point, she was in her 70s, an age of advanced decrepitude for the 12th century. Yet she displayed the energy and political acumen of a person half her age. This was the queen who had been a political player on the European stage for over half a century, who had been on crusade herself, who had ruled vast territories in her own right, and who had survived 16 years of imprisonment at the hands of her own husband. The crisis of her favorite son's capture was her final and perhaps greatest challenge. From her base in England, she took charge of the government, working with loyal ministers to crush John's rebellion and to organize the monumental task of raising the ransom. She wrote impassioned, pleading letters to the Pope, castigating him for his inaction in securing the release of Christendom's greatest crusader. She then personally oversaw the collection of the vast treasure, a logistical nightmare of taxes, confiscations, and donations. When the bulk of the ransom was finally gathered, she did not delegate the final, perilous task. In the winter of 1193, this elderly queen personally escorted the immense hoard of silver and gold across the frozen roads of northern Europe, traveling deep into the heart of the hostile German Empire to negotiate directly with Emperor Henry VI. She was the ultimate guarantor of the deal, the living embodiment of the Plantagenet dynasty, offering herself as a hostage if needed to ensure her son's freedom. Her role cannot be overstated. Without Eleanor's tireless efforts, Richard might have rotted in his cell. Without her political authority, England would likely have descended into a full-blown civil war. She was the bedrock upon which Richard's chaotic, war-torn career was built. He provided the military glory and the heroic legend, but she provided the political stability and the administrative glue that allowed the kingdom to survive his long and ruinous absences. She was the silent, often unacknowledged partner in his reign, the Queen Mother whose fierce maternal loyalty and unmatched political skill saved her lion-hearted son from the consequences of his own reckless pride. When Richard finally set foot on English soil again in March 1194, after more than 4 years away, He was a whirlwind of vengeful energy. The chroniclers describe a king moving with astonishing speed and purpose, a man on fire to reclaim what was his. He swiftly dealt with the last vestiges of his brother John's rebellion, besieging and capturing the remaining rebel-held castles in a matter of weeks. He then had himself recrowned in a grand ceremony at Winchester, a powerful symbolic act designed to wash away the shame of his captivity and reassert his absolute authority. But these were mere preliminaries. His true focus, his all-consuming obsession, lay across the Channel. He spent less than 2 months in England, just long enough to raise yet more money and men, before sailing for France to confront his great rival, Philip II. What he found was a continental empire in crisis. The first cracks, which had appeared during his absence, had now widened into gaping fissures. Philip's patient, opportunistic campaigns had gnawed away at the borders of Normandy, and many of Richard's vassals, believing him to be imprisoned for life, had switched their allegiance to the French king. The kingdom Richard had returned to was financially shattered. The first bleeding for the Crusade, followed by the second, far worse bleeding for the ransom, had left the royal coffers empty and the taxpayers exhausted. The years of war and instability had taken their toll on the land and the people. But Richard seemed oblivious to this. His mindset was that of a general, not a king. He saw the problem not as one of institutional weakness or economic ruin, but simply as a military challenge to be overcome. His entire focus for the remaining 5 years of his life would be this single grinding conflict. The war to push Philip out of his lands and restore the integrity of his continental empire. He would never again return to England. The island kingdom would remain for him what it had always been, a source of funds and soldiers, a vital but distant resource for the real business of his life, which was war in France. The storm had been weathered, but the ship of state was leaking badly, and the captain was obsessed only with the pirates on the horizon, ignoring the rot in his own timbers. In the grand and grinding war against Philip of France, one project came to symbolize the very essence of Richard's strategic thinking, his engineering genius, and his ruinous obsession with military solutions. The construction of Château Gaillard, the saucy castle. Perched on a high chalk bluff overlooking a critical bend in the River Seine and the town of Les Andelys, this fortress was designed to be the ultimate statement of Plantagenet power, the unbreakable lock that would secure the border of Normandy and block Philip's route to the Norman capital, Rouen. Built in a breathtakingly short span of just 2 years, between 1196 and 1198, it was a masterpiece of military architecture, far ahead of its time. Richard, who was a gifted engineer, personally oversaw its design, incorporating the latest innovations he had witnessed on Crusade. It had concentric rings of walls, interlocking fields of fire, and a formidable inner keep with thick, sloping walls designed to deflect projectiles. It was a machine for killing, a declaration in stone that this land belonged to him. He poured a fortune into its construction, a sum estimated to be almost double what he spent on all castle building in England. He called it his fair child of 1 year, his poulain, and he loved it with a father's pride. But this act of creation was also an act of obsession, a fateful error in strategic judgment. Château Gaillard was a symptom of his core flaw. He believed that the security of his vast, multicultural empire could be guaranteed by a single, impregnable fortress. He was focused on building a perfect shield for one border, while the political and economic heart of his kingdom was sickening. The immense cost of the castle further drained his already depleted treasury, requiring yet more taxes and alienating his subjects. He was securing the door of the house while the foundations were crumbling. The psychology behind this decision is telling. It was an engineer's solution to a politician's problem. Richard was more comfortable with stone and mortar, with clear lines of sight and defensible angles, than he was with the messy, unpredictable world of diplomacy, administration, and finance. Chateau Gaillard was his ultimate monument, but it was a monument to his particular brand of flawed genius, the ability to solve any military problem, except the most important one: how to rule in peace. The final years of Richard's life were not a grand clash of titans like the Third Crusade, but a slow, grinding, and ultimately attritional war of sieges and skirmishes fought in the muddy fields and dense forests of Normandy, Aquitaine, and the Vexin. The epic poetry of the Holy Land had been replaced by the dreary prose of feudal warfare. This was not a war for God, but a bitter, personal struggle for land and castles, a seemingly endless series of campaigns against his rival Philip and Philip's allies among Richard's own rebellious vassals. The great hero of Christendom was now bogged down in a geopolitical swamp. He was still a brilliant commander, winning a string of victories like the one at Fretval in 1194, where he utterly routed Philip's army and captured the entire French royal baggage train, including the state archives. But these victories were never decisive. For every castle he recaptured, another vassal would rebel. For every league of territory he regained, Philip would use diplomacy and intrigue to undermine him elsewhere. This was a war he could not win outright, because his opponent was playing a different game. Philip understood that time was on his side. He knew that Richard's empire was a financial house of cards, held together only by Richard's personal military prowess and the constant infusion of English silver. Philip could afford to lose battles as long as he continued to exhaust Richard's resources and encourage dissent within his lands. The greatest catastrophe of Richard's reign was not a single, dramatic defeat, but this slow, corrosive stalemate. It was the chipping away of his legend, the transformation of the crusading hero into just another feudal warlord, squabbling over ditches and walls. He was winning tactically, but losing strategically. The constant need for money made him ever more rapacious in his demands on his subjects, breeding resentment. His long absence from England allowed the administrative structures to weaken further. The Lionheart was like a magnificent fighting bull, charging again and again at the red cape of the French king, slowly bleeding its strength away, unaware that the matador's true weapon was not the cape, but the patiently waiting sword. The end came not in a blaze of glory, but in a squalid, almost farcical sideshow. The year was 1199. A rumor had reached the king, a story that a local vassal, a chard, the Viscount of Limoges, had unearthed a fabulous treasure on his lands near the castle of Chalus-Chabrol. The legend varied. Some said it was a hoard of ancient Roman gold, others that it was a set of life-sized golden statues of an emperor and his family. According to feudal law, a portion of such a find was due to the overlord, Richard himself. When the Viscount offered him only a fraction, Richard, perpetually short of cash to fund his wars, flew into a rage. He laid siege to the small, insignificant castle, determined to take the treasure by force. It was a petty, greedy affair, a king behaving like a common bandit. The garrison at Chalus was tiny, barely a handful of men. On the evening of the 25th of March, Richard was inspecting the siege lines, directing his sappers as they undermined the castle walls. In a moment of supreme arrogance, born from a lifetime of surviving far greater perils, he was walking the perimeter without his full armor, protected only by a helmet. He scoffed at the defenders, treating the entire affair as a joke. From the battlements, a lone crossbowman, a man later identified as Pierre Basile, let loose a bolt. It was a poorly aimed, almost random shot, but it found its mark, striking Richard in the left shoulder, near the neck. This was the collapse, the final absurd twist of fate. The man who had faced the elite cavalry of Saladin, who had fought in the front ranks of 100 charges, was laid low by a stray shot from a boy on a wall in a battle over rumor and greed. It was the ultimate anticlimax, a death so out of sync with his life's grand narrative that it felt like a cruel joke played by destiny. The invincible warrior had forgotten the first rule of warfare, that death can come from anywhere, at any time, and it has no respect for reputation. The surgeon who attended the king made a mess of extracting the crossbow bolt, mangling the flesh, and leaving the wound unclean. In the days that followed, as the sweet smell of rot filled the tent, Richard knew he was dying. The wound had turned black, and the gangrene was spreading. As the fever consumed him, he set his affairs in order, naming his brother John as his heir, and then, in a final extraordinary act of chivalry, he summoned the man who had shot him. The crossbowman's, Pierre Basile, was a boy, some sources say, who claimed he was taking revenge for his father and 2 brothers, whom Richard had killed in a previous campaign. He stood before the dying king, expecting a terrible death. But Richard, in his last hours, chose to perform one final scene from the epic of his own life. He looked at the boy and pardoned him. He ordered that Basile be set free and given a sum of 100 shillings. It was a moment of sublime mercy, a flicker of the noble, Christ-like king he had always aspired to be in the songs, if not always in his deeds. It was his final act of command, a last attempt to control his own narrative, to die not as a greedy warlord, but as a magnanimous Christian king. On the 6th of April, 1199, with his 77-year-old mother Eleanor at his side, holding him in her arms, the Lionheart died. The king who had spent his life restlessly roaming his vast empire had come to his final stillness. His pardon, however, was ignored. As soon as the king was dead, a mercenary captain named Mercadier, one of Richard's most brutal lieutenants, seized Basile, had him flayed alive, and then hanged. The king's final act of mercy was immediately erased by the brutal reality of the world he had created, a world governed not by chivalry, but by vengeance and cold steel. The hero's finale was a complex tableau, a noble deathbed forgiveness, a gruesome, ignoble revenge, and the quiet grief of a mother who had now outlived almost all of her warring, devilish brood. The legacy of Richard the Lionheart is a battlefield of conflicting interpretations, a testament to a man who was so many different things to so many different people. In England, his memory is profoundly schizophrenic. On one hand, he is the heroic figure of romance and folklore, the quintessential English king, brave, chivalrous, the noble crusader immortalized by Walter Scott and Hollywood. This is the Richard of the popular imagination, the valiant warrior who stands as a symbol of English martial pride. But among historians and for his actual English subjects of the 12th century, the reality was starkly different. He was the absentee king, a French prince who spoke little or no English, and who saw the kingdom not as a home, but as a source of revenue for his foreign ambitions. He visited England only twice during his 10-year reign, for a total of perhaps 6 months. He bled the country dry with his taxes, sold off its offices, and cared little for its governance or its people. His reign was, from a purely English perspective, a disaster, saved from complete collapse only by the competence of his ministers and the resilience of his mother. In France, however, his legacy is far less ambiguous. To the French, he was not an English king, but the most formidable of the great French feudal lords, the powerful Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, and the greatest single obstacle to the unification of the French kingdom under the Capetian dynasty. He was the enemy, a brilliant and terrifying adversary whose death was a moment of profound relief and opportunity for the French crown, paving the way for Philip II to finally dismantle the Angevin Empire. In the wider context of the Crusades, he is remembered as a legendary tactician and a peerless field commander, the only Christian leader who could consistently defeat Saladin in open battle. Yet he was ultimately a failed crusader. He never reached his goal of liberating Jerusalem, and the treaty he signed, while pragmatic, was a far cry from the glorious reconquest he had set out to achieve. He remains a man of profound contradictions, a terrible king for England, a magnificent enemy for France, and a tragic hero for Christendom. So we return to the central burning question: how did the hero of the Crusades die at the hand of a peasant? The final comprehensive answer is that Richard the Lionheart died at Chabrol because his character was his fate. The very qualities that made him a legendary warrior were the ones that made him a flawed king and a vulnerable man. He died because his arrogance, forged in the crucible of epic conflicts against the greatest army in the world, made him contemptuous of minor threats. A man who had survived the disciplined charges of Saladin's Mamluks could not conceive of being brought low by a boy with a crossbow on the wall of a third-rate castle. He had come to believe in his own myth, in the idea that he was a protagonist in an epic poem, a hero shielded by destiny. But destiny is impartial, and a crossbow bolt fired in anger travels just as fast toward a king as it does a common soldier. Furthermore, he died because his obsession with the performance of war had completely eclipsed the practice of kingship. He had transformed from a holy crusader, fighting for a transcendent cause, into a mere feudal warlord, squabbling over land and treasure. The siege of Chalus was not a noble endeavor. It was a shakedown, a sordid dispute driven by greed. The great lion of Christendom had been reduced to fighting for scraps at his own table. This narrowing of his vision, this descent from the grand stage of the Holy Land to the muddy ditch in the Limousin, was the true catastrophe. He lost sight of the bigger picture, forgetting that an empire is not held together by fortresses alone, but by a sound economy, a loyal populace, and a king who understands that his first duty is to his people, not his own glory. He was a lion, yes, but he was a lion who had wandered into a land of foxes and traps, and the simplest of traps, baited with his own greed and sprung by a moment of careless pride, was all it took to bring the great beast down. The verdict of history on Richard the Lionheart is a profound and universal lesson about the eternal conflict between substance and style, between the reality of governance and the romance of war. His life is a testament to the fact that a man can win every single battle and still lose the war. He was perhaps the greatest military commander of his age, a tactician of genius, a man of incredible personal courage, and an inspiration to his soldiers. But these very virtues were inextricably linked to his vices as a ruler. The single-minded focus that made him a brilliant general made him a neglectful king. The personal love of combat that made him a hero on the battlefield made him reckless and ultimately led to his death. His story demonstrates the ultimate futility of a politics based purely on personal charisma and military might. The Angevin Empire he inherited was a vast and powerful entity, but it was held together by the sheer force of its ruler's will. It lacked the deep institutional roots and the sense of national identity that his rival, Philip II, was so patiently building in France. Richard's reign, with its endless wars and ruinous taxes, exhausted his empire, while Philip's patient state-building strengthened his. Richard built castles of stone, while Philip built a kingdom of laws and loyalties. When the Lionheart died, the linchpin was removed, and the entire magnificent, unwieldy structure of the Angevin Empire began to collapse, a process that would be completed under the disastrous reign of his brother John. The universal lesson of Richard's life is that true power, the kind that endures, is not forged in the spectacular fire of a single battle or the life of a single hero. It is built slowly, patiently, and often thanklessly in the tedious but vital work of administration, justice, and good governance. Richard the Lionheart won himself an immortal legend, but in doing so, he mortgaged the future of his empire. His death was not merely the end of a man, it was the beginning of the end for the world he represented. The final frame, the image that encapsulates the glorious, tragic, and ultimately hollow legacy of Richard the Lionheart, is that of his fair child, his beloved Château Gaillard, standing defiant and magnificent on its cliff overlooking the Seine. For a few short years after its master's death, it stood as he had intended, impregnable, a symbol of Plantagenet power, the ultimate shield of Normandy. It seemed a permanent monument to his genius, but it was a monument built on sand. The empire it was meant to protect was rotting from within, bankrupted by Richard's wars and misgoverned by his brother John. Only 5 years after Richard's death, his great rival Philip II laid siege to the fortress. After a long and arduous campaign, the impregnable castle fell. Its capture was not just a military victory for France, it was a psychological death blow to the Angevin cause. With Château Gaillard gone, the rest of Normandy crumbled quickly, and the great continental empire that Henry II had built and Richard had fought so furiously to defend was lost forever. The castle stands today, a beautiful and haunting ruin. It is the perfect metaphor for Richard's entire life, a work of breathtaking military brilliance, built at enormous cost, designed for a single purpose, war, and ultimately, a spectacular failure. It is a monument to a legacy of glorious victories that led to a strategic defeat, a testament to a king who was a master of the art of battle, but a failure at the art of building anything that would last beyond his own lifetime. The shadow of the ruined castle falls long across the Norman landscape, a silent, stony epitaph for the Lionheart, the king who won the world and lost his kingdom.